I thought it would be constructive to make a video covering some of the more commonly encountered logical fallacies committed within the context of the internet being the place these days where most discussion takes place. And being a fallible human being, I too sometimes commit logical fallacies, but I do make an effort to avoid them whenever possible. Good argumentation, after all, whatever the topic might be, should consist of an awareness of common logical fallacies, as well as an avoidance of them. Unfortunately, anyone who has spent any amount of time online knows full well that most people do not care whether or not they're committing logical fallacies, and indeed, some people knowingly commit them in an effort to bolster their cause, confident that doing so will garner more support for them than a commitment to rational argumentation ever would, something politicians, for example, and those of their ilk commonly do. This overview, I should stress, is not meant to be comprehensive, but rather the intention is to cover some of the more common logical fallacies by describing them and giving them examples. Some will be applicable to the internet in the wider sense, and some will be encountered in the manosphere as well. I will reiterate the point that this list is not meant to be comprehensive later in the video. If interest does exist, I would be happy to further pursue the topic and related topics such as propositional calculus. I'm also not going to distinguish between formal and informal fallacies, as that is beyond the scope of this video, though I would be happy to cover the difference in a separate video. Additionally, fallacies are sometimes a matter of interpretation, as there can be some crossover between the types. The argumentum ad passiones, or the appeal to emotion. This type of fallacy appeals to human emotion rather than presenting sound reasoning. Appeals to emotion attempt to invoke feelings of fear, hatred, envy, guilt, and similar feelings in an effort to persuade those hearing the argument. It is entirely possible, however, to make an argument containing some emotional element, but if this becomes a primary means of persuasion, then it becomes an argumentum ad passiones, or an appeal to emotion. This type of fallacy is usually used as a tactic of deflection to avoid properly answering criticism. There are, in fact, subcategories of this fallacy which reference specific emotions, but I'm not going to cover them here. An example of this is imputing the emotion of envy to someone making reasoned criticisms of something such as a book, video content, or an article. Citing the reasons for making the criticism are born of envy rather than addressing the individual points made. Within this context, the critical arguments are usually not addressed at all, and the response boils down to, "You're just saying that stuff because you were envious of my success." Another example of this would be the arguments offered by the U.S. government to justify the bank bailout several years back, and an appeal to the emotion of fear. If we do not do X, then calamity will follow, without actually offering real or convincing reasons for doing so, and indeed, in this case, it was an active attempt to hide their true intentions. The argumentum ad populum, or the appeal to popularity. This fallacy entails appealing to the popularity of something or someone as a means of gauging its validity, when in reality, the popularity and mass appeal of something or someone has nothing to do with the truth of claims being made in the name of that thing or by that person. Put more simply, just because something is popular or is even endorsed by a majority does not mean it is true. A historical example of this would be arguing for a geocentric model of the solar system, simply because at some point in time, a majority of people held this to be true. But that majority view did nothing to change the fact that we, in fact, live in a heliocentric solar system. Likewise, someone arguing that PewDiePie makes the best content on YouTube based solely on him being the most popular YouTuber, without offering additional criteria, would be committing this fallacy. The straw man. The straw man fallacy consists of intentionally or unintentionally misrepresenting a person's argument or position in order to make it easier to counter than it would be to counter the actual argument. By doing so, the straw man arguments ascribed to the person make the person seem unreasonable, paint him in a bad light, or simply make him seem crazy. This is perhaps one of the most commonly encountered fallacies. An example of this would be someone saying that fruits and vegetables should be consumed in abundance on a daily basis, to which is replied, "He said that no one should eat any meat or dairy," when the original statement did not contain any mention either pro or con of meat or dairy. Likewise, a straw man of one position I personally hold as a MGTOW content producer is the following. I find that a minimalist lifestyle is very beneficial to me personally, because I have less stress, more free time, better health, and enjoy life more, which is then hyperbolically strawmanned into claiming that I have dictated that MGTOW must take vows of poverty, must not seek to acquire wealth, and that all men who do not choose to live in poverty are not MGTOW. The straw man fallacy can be very effective if those listening to the straw man are not familiar with the original arguments or statements made and are unwilling to reference the original material. The genetic fallacy, or the fallacy of origins. This fallacy makes an appeal to the origins of someone in an effort to discredit his claims and statements, rather than focusing on the validity of said claims and statements independent of the person making them. A classic example of this from the manosphere is the genetic fallacy in reference to the observations that Robert Briffaut made, sometimes known as Briffaut's Law, where it was cited that he was a communist and thus his observations of the human animal were inapplicable or not true. Another example of this would be to claim that a Japanese historian's account of early 20th century Korea must necessarily be inaccurate because he is Japanese and thus his view must be colored by Japan's colonial past. The non sequitur fallacy. Stemming from the Latin, it does not follow. Most people are familiar with this fallacy, where the conclusions drawn from an argument do not match up with the premise. An example of this might be the following. Someone was seen extremely drunk 3 weeks ago. Therefore, that person is an alcoholic. However, it does not follow that one can deduce alcoholism from a single episode of intoxication, and that said person is an alcoholic. Another example of this would be in the manosphere, in the following. Minimalist MGTOW do not seek to maximize their financial gains. Therefore, minimalist MGTOW live in filth and misery. It does not follow simply because some MGTOW do not prioritize wealth acquisition that they must live in filth and misery. This particular one combines ad hominem with non sequitur. The argument from authority. This is also sometimes called an appeal to authority. And this fallacy consists of the claim that because someone is an expert or respected in an area or field of study, what he says must therefore necessarily be true. It is important that one distinguish between the likelihood that expertise or consensus amongst experts is usually a sign of validity and the claim that expertise necessarily constitutes validity. Often, arguments from authority form a type of non sequitur. An example of this would be the following. A Nobel Prize-winning chemist supports the position of the central bank of his country. Therefore, the central bank's position must be true. The flaw in reasoning here is that expertise in one field does not transfer over into unrelated fields most of the time, and certainly in this case. This is an unfounded appeal to authority. Other forms consist of people unable to back up their claims. A person arguing for the soundness of the existence of the Christian deity and claims that Francis Collins, former leader of the Human Genome Project, is a Christian, and therefore the Christian God must exist, is yet another example. The argumentum ad natura, or the appeal to nature. This should not be confused with the naturalistic fallacy, from which the appeal to nature is distinct, in fact. The naturalistic fallacy has a moral aspect to it that an appeal to nature can have but need not have. An example of an appeal to nature would be the following. Tobacco occurs naturally, therefore it is good for one's health to consume tobacco. An example of a naturalistic fallacy, on the other hand, would be the following. All living organisms seek to reproduce. Human beings are living organisms, therefore it is morally correct for human beings to reproduce. The golden mean fallacy. Also called the middle ground fallacy. This fallacy occurs when it is argued that the position between two extremes is necessarily the correct one. This reasoning is incorrect because it does not follow that the mean position is correct simply because it is in the middle ground between two extremes. The persuasive power of this argument comes from the fact that some forms of moderation are very beneficial. Moderate eating, exercising, etc., encapsulated in the statement of all things in moderation. But the fallacy lies in drawing a conclusion from one thing, such as moderate eating is beneficial to the middle ground, is by necessity correct. An example of this is to be found in some forms of agnosticism. Theists believe that there is a God, atheists believe there is no God, therefore agnosticism, uncertainty of the existence of God, the middle ground, must be correct. Another example would be the following. One government official proposes cutting spending on a certain program by 70% and another by only 10%. Therefore, spending cuts on program X should be placed at 40%, because 40% occupies a good middle ground. It's certainly possible that 40% is the correct percentage, but it does not necessarily follow merely because 40% lies somewhere in between 10 and 70%. The No True Scotsman Fallacy. The No True Scotsman fallacy attempts to counteract factual claims or statements made about a person by exclusion, citing that said person does not actually belong to the group in question. An example of this would be the following. American soldiers tortured captive prisoners in Iraq, to which is replied, "No true American would do such a thing," i.e., these were not real Americans. The No True Scotsman fallacy is primarily a tactic of deflection, because it dismisses actions being presented as irrelevant because the participants in said actions do not belong to the group, and therefore the claims about them do not need to be addressed. The ad hominem, a very common fallacy most people are familiar with, meaning literally in the Latin, to the man. An ad hominem attacks the person making an argument or presenting claims rather than the claims or arguments themselves. Ad hominem fallacies are by far the most common type of fallacy encountered in the manosphere. Examples include the following. If you're a man going your own way, it must be because you are fat, ugly, and cannot get laid. Or if you do not wish to date or interact with women, it must be because you are a coward who is hurt and is afraid of dealing with your feelings. In both cases, the prosecutor of the ad hominem is not interested in the reasons offered by the man going his own way and attacks his person or speculates on his character as a means of circumventing actually addressing the issues he raises and the reasons he cites for going his own way. The petitio principii, or begging the question. From the Latin, seeking the beginning, this is essentially circular reasoning, where there is no premise, merely a conclusion. A very common example of this is the Christian argument that the Bible is divine because it is stated in the Bible itself. The alleged premise is identical to the conclusion, thus why this is a fallacy. Sometimes begging the question fallacies are more difficult to detect. A prosecutor in a court might ask the defendant, "How did you feel when you killed the man?" This is a more subtle form of begging the question and rhetorical device used to elicit a response from the defendant that will be self-incriminating. A Manispherian variant of this might be, "It is unnatural to abstain from sex because not having sex is unnatural." The Texas sharpshooter, or cherry-picking fallacy. The Texas sharpshooter fallacy is based on incomplete evidence. There can be large overlap with the fallacy of anecdotal evidence, and the two are not always mutually exclusive. Cherry-picking arguments select data to fit the arguments being made whilst ignoring other data that may be present. An example of this might be the following. McDonald's points to 5 countries where health and life expectancy are greater than average, and where McDonald's has a very strong presence to conclude that McDonald's food contributes to this health and longer life expectancy. Even though there may or may not be an actual correlation, McDonald's is cherry-picking the data in order to win the argument. The fallacy of composition. The fallacy of composition is committed when a conclusion is drawn concerning a whole based on its parts or constituents. An example of this would be the following. Because one theory offered by a branch of science seems tenuous, the entire discipline on the whole is untrue or incorrect. This is a fallacy of composition because even if theory X of said scientific field is incorrect, it does not follow that all theories and ideas in the field are incorrect. It is important to note that there are cases where inferences drawn from parts are sufficient to justify conclusions. In the manosphere, for example, observations backed up by studies, statistics, and similar data concerning mass trends in the behavior of the human female must not fall within the category of the fallacy of composition, though it is possible. A data set limited to American divorce rates could lead to a fallacy of composition, but data sets covering divorce across dozens and dozens of countries would not, if the data are correctly interpreted. The fallacy of personal incredulity. This fallacy occurs when a person argues that something cannot be true or correct on the basis of his inability to understand or relate to the points being made. This fallacy is fairly common in the context of evolution. For example, as humans are mammals, we are distantly related to hippopotami. "No way," he replies. "Have you ever looked at a hippopotamus? I can't believe it. They look nothing like us." And this fallacy is relatively common in the context of chaste MGTOW, who has sworn off women altogether. Man going his way asserts that he's no longer interested in pursuing women in any capacity, and the person responds, "Not possible, man. No way. I could never do that. You must be lying and secretly wish you could get laid." Fallacy of personal incredulity. The slippery slope fallacy. The slippery slope argument is invalid because it asserts that because one thing comes to pass, something else, most often unrelated, must necessarily follow from that. Examples of this are the following. If you legalize prostitution in New York State, theft and murder will be legalized too. Or if we lower the drinking age, alcoholism will become more rampant. If evolution is taught in school, people will believe that they are monkeys and act like savages. None of the consequences cited here necessarily follow or are even relevant to the premise, which is why these are slippery slope arguments. Now, there are many other types of fallacies and variants of the fallacies I presented here. For example, many people break down the appeal to emotion into further categories based on the specific emotions being appealed to. But, as I have stated previously, the intention behind this video was to give an overview of logical fallacies for those unfamiliar with the concept and a reinforcement of knowledge for those already familiar, not to provide a comprehensive list of every logical fallacy that human beings can possibly commit. But the topic raises the important question as to why it is so easy for us to slip into committing fallacies whilst remaining oblivious to the fact that we're committing them. It took a great deal of commitment and energy, primarily in ancient Greece, to tease out a rational means of expressing thought in the form of argumentation. But this commitment and energy is not something that readily comes to us, and sometimes appeals to emotion and rhetorical flourish seem to yield better results with people. And more to the point, as I've pointed out in the past, rational thought and behavior are hardly guarantors of happiness and positive feelings. Instead, human beings prefer to dwell in the realm of whatever makes them feel good, and rational argumentation is just one of many things that often falls by the wayside in doing so. And thus, it might seem difficult, if not impossible, to find convincing reasons for engaging in rational behavior and argumentation. But in truth, this is not the case. The whole of what we can call modern civilization owes its existence to men who are able to cast aside natural inclinations towards the irrational in favor of what is sometimes difficult to pursue and maintain, reason, thought, and speech, which have yielded fruits of labor that are quite possibly unquantifiable in their benefit. Upon reflecting on this, it becomes clear why an adherence to rationality is important, for it is about the long-term gains, the road not taken, or rather the road taken by few, or fewer. And one thing remains constant. Future progress will only find its wellspring in the mind dedicated to consistency and reason, the mind that, despite its failings and setbacks, strives forward to understand the world on its own terms, not the terms humans wish exist in terms of self-deception, but that which is and that which could be. And that which could be is not lost to wishful thinking, but is actually realized in the fires of reason. I hope this video was helpful, and thanks for watching.